The story begins with a married couple, George and Sandra Vickers, in a peaceful and happy life in their grand, luxurious home. They were a loving couple who had been looking forward to a very special day, the return of their only son, Jimmy Vickers. It was revealed that Jimmy had been serving as a soldier in Afghanistan for a long time, and his parents were overjoyed that he was finally coming home. As a result, Sandra eagerly prepared everything to welcome him back, making sure the house was perfect for their reunion. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of town, a dangerous gang was plotting a crime. They had been watching a woman for some time, waiting for the right moment to rob her. Sitting inside their car, they smoked illegal drugs and discussed their plan. When they spotted the woman leaving the bank after completing a transaction, they knew it was time to act. Acting quickly, the gang put on their masks and followed her car through the city streets. As the woman drove under a bridge, the gang suddenly blocked her path and forced her to stop. With menacing voices, they demanded she hand over the money she had just withdrawn. The terrified woman, shaking with fear, insisted that she had no idea what they were talking about. One of the robbers searched her car, but found nothing. Frustrated and angry, another gang member suggested they take her hostage instead. At the same time, George Vickers happened to be passing by. Sensing something was wrong, he quickly stepped in to stop the criminals. He bravely confronted the gang, urging them to leave the woman alone. But one of the robbers, a man named Josh, refused to back down. Furious that someone was interfering with their plan, he grabbed a baseball bat and struck George on the left arm. Despite the pain, George refused to give up. Summoning all his strength, he wrestled the bat away from Josh and swung it back, hitting Josh on the head. The impact was so strong that Josh collapsed to the ground, unconscious. Moments later, the distant wail of police sirens filled the air. Realizing they were in trouble, the rest of the gang panicked and ran off, abandoning Josh behind. As they fled, one of them turned back to threaten George, warning him that he would regret what he had done. When the police arrived, they immediately treated George's injured arm and questioned him about what had happened. Among the officers was Detective Spencer Holland, who assessed the situation carefully. After checking on Josh, the detective turned to George with serious news. Josh had died from the blow to his head. Though George had acted in self-defense, Spencer had no choice but to arrest him for taking a life. George was shocked to hear this, unable to believe what had just happened. Elsewhere, the gang members who had escaped returned to their hideout, a crime-ridden base run by their ruthless leader, Warren Evans. Inside, some of the gang members were using illegal drugs, while others were preparing packages to sell. When Warren heard what had happened, he was furious. Not only had his men failed their mission, but they had also left behind Josh, who was, in fact, Warren's younger brother. Overcome with rage and grief, Warren vowed to take revenge. He ordered his men to track down George Vickers and make him pay. That night, Warren and his men, Caleb, Danny, Rob, and Ryan, were lurking in the shadows, watching George and Sandra Vickers as they returned home. After waiting for the right moment, they stepped out of their car and approached the house. Without warning, they stormed inside and overpowered George and Sandra, leaving them defenseless. After tying them up, Warren and his gang cruelly recorded their suffering, taunting them as they poured gasoline over their helpless bodies. With cold-hearted intent, they set fire to the house, watching as flames engulfed it before disappearing into the night. The next day, Jimmy Vickers arrived from Afghanistan, only to be met with devastating news. His parents had died in a horrific fire at their home. Grief-stricken, he barely had time to process his loss before receiving a call from his best friend, Griff, a police officer. At that moment, Griff expressed his deep condolences and assured Jimmy that he would do everything in his power to find those responsible for his parents' brutal murder. Determined to uncover the truth, Jimmy visited a local bar near his home, hoping to gather clues about what had happened that fateful night. At the bar, he approached the bartender, Terry Grobbs, and ordered a drink. As he sipped, he pressed Terry for details about the attack on his parents. However, Terry hesitated, clearly afraid to talk. He avoided Jimmy's questions, not wanting to get tangled up with the ruthless gangsters in the area. Sensing the bartender's reluctance, Jimmy's frustration grew, and he caused a commotion in the bar. Afraid of further trouble, Terry finally revealed that he had heard George and Sandra screaming on the night of the fire. Through the window, he had seen 4 men fleeing the burning house, but had been too scared to do anything besides calling the fire department. Armed with this new information, Jimmy visited the charred remains of his family home. As he searched through the wreckage, he spotted a half-burned photo of himself with his parents. Holding it in his hands, the weight of his loss crushed him, making his grief even more unbearable. Not long after, Griff arrived, worried about his friend. He tried to comfort Jimmy, but the soldier was too consumed by anger and sorrow. Jimmy rejected any sympathy, demanding that Griff tell him who was behind his parents' murder. Unfortunately, Griff had no concrete answers. The police had reviewed surveillance footage, but the perpetrators had been careful to avoid being clearly identified. This only fueled Jimmy's frustration. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Griff watching after him, hoping he would find the strength to seek justice the right way. The following day, Jimmy visited his parents' graves, standing in silence as grief weighed heavily on him. Afterward, he went to a nearby church, hoping to find some peace. While he sat there lost in thought, his wife, Morgan, arrived and gently tried to comfort him. She mentioned that she had sent him several emails, but he never responded. Jimmy explained that he had been on a war mission and didn't have time to reply. Concerned for his well-being, Morgan insisted on taking him home. She knew how much he was hurting after losing his parents. However, Jimmy remained distant and cold, their strained relationship showing through. They had been struggling for a long time, and their marriage was on the verge of ending in divorce. Feeling that there was nothing left to say, Jimmy decided to leave the church, walking away from Morgan without another word. Meanwhile, at Warren's headquarters, a young man and a girl arrived, looking to buy illegal drugs. However, Warren tricked them, claiming they didn't have enough money for the drugs. When they protested, the young man was beaten brutally. The terrified girl, desperate to get what she came for, was forced to submit to Warren's demands in exchange for the drugs. Several days later, Jimmy is seen in a cafe, sipping his coffee, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. A man inside the cafe and another across the street seemed to be keeping an eye on him. As he pondered their presence, his phone rang. It was Griff. In response, Jimmy quickly told him to meet in his car. Inside the car, Griff shared crucial information. He revealed that Warren's car had been spotted near Jimmy's parents' house on the night of the murders. He also explained how George had intervened to stop a robbery committed by Warren's gang. To back up his claims, Griff handed Jimmy a flash drive containing surveillance footage from the night of the robbery. That night, filled with uncontrollable rage, Jimmy headed to the address Griff had given him. At the same time, Warren was at a fitness center, finishing his workout. Jimmy parked nearby, waiting patiently for him to come out. Eventually, Warren left the gym and walked toward his car, ready to head home. Just as he was about to drive away, Jimmy deliberately crashed into his car. Enraged, Warren got out to confront the driver, only to be met with a vicious surprise. Jimmy sprang from his vehicle and attacked him, beating him mercilessly. Once Warren was unconscious, Jimmy dragged him away, covering his head before taking him to an unknown location. When Warren regained consciousness, he found himself tied up inside a car. Fear flashed across his face as he realized the situation. Jimmy, filled with fury, demanded the names of the men who had murdered his parents. Warren refused to speak, so Jimmy grabbed a can of gasoline and poured it around the car, making it clear he was willing to do whatever it took to get the truth. After Jimmy threatened Warren, saying he would release him if he revealed the names of those involved in his parents' murder, Warren, terrified and desperate, finally gave in. He spilled the information Jimmy wanted, hoping to save his own life. But Jimmy had no intention of letting him go. Instead, he lit a cigarette, then tossed it onto the gasoline-soaked car, setting it ablaze with Warren still trapped inside. Without a hint of remorse, Jimmy turned his back on the burning car and drove away, heading straight to Morgan's house. Upon arriving, their conversation quickly turned into an argument. As tensions rose, Jimmy decided to leave, but as he stood up, Morgan's eyes caught sight of a deep wound on his stomach. Concerned, she insisted that he stay and let her treat it before going anywhere. As she carefully cleaned and dressed his wound, the tension between them softened. Morgan gently asked what had happened to him, but Jimmy only gave a vague response, saying it was complicated. Sensing his reluctance to talk, she chose not to push further. While she was tending to him, Jimmy noticed the divorce papers sitting on the table. Without hesitation, he stated that he would not sign them. It was ironic, considering he was the one who had initially filed for divorce. His words created an awkward silence between them, and feeling the shift in the mood, Jimmy got up to leave. Before he could walk out, Morgan offered to let him stay for the night. After a brief hesitation, he accepted, and they silently agreed to let the moment be. The next morning, Morgan stopped by a cafe, where a news broadcast on the television caught her attention. The screen displayed a breaking story. Warren had been found dead in a burned-out car. At the crime scene, police officers and journalists crowded the area, investigating the shocking murder. Meanwhile, at Warren's headquarters, Rob was furious, unable to accept the brutal death of his boss. He turned to Ryan, expressing his anger and suspicion. The identity of Warren's killer was still unknown, but Rob had his doubts. He suspected Caleb of betraying them and taking Warren out. That night, determined to uncover the truth, Rob and Ryan stormed into Caleb's house, guns drawn, demanding answers. Caleb, caught off guard, swore he had nothing to do with Warren's murder. Suddenly, his girlfriend appeared from behind, pointing a gun at Rob and Ryan. Forced to back down, they let him go, but not without a warning. Rob made it clear, if Caleb was lying, they would return, and next time, there would be no mercy. On the other hand, Jimmy, still restless and filled with questions, finally decided to check the flash drive Griff had given him. He plugged it in and watched the surveillance footage, his eyes narrowing as he saw his father, George, stepping in to protect a woman from a violent robbery. Jimmy's anger burned even brighter after watching the tape. The painful memories of his parents' murder fueled his desire for revenge, and he couldn't wait any longer to make the killers pay. Determined, he sought out Griff to gather information about the remaining murderers. When Jimmy met Griff, he immediately asked for the addresses of the other culprits. However, Griff was deeply concerned about Jimmy's plan. He warned him that seeking revenge was incredibly dangerous and urged him to let the police handle the case instead. He believed that justice should be served through legal means. But Jimmy refused to listen. He couldn't accept the idea that his parents' murderers would only receive a prison sentence. To him, that was not enough. At that moment, Griff tried to reason with him, saying that revenge would only lead to an endless cycle of violence. However, Jimmy remained firm. He had lost faith in the legal system, believing that many officers ignored the pleas of ordinary people. Before leaving, he made it clear that he would stop at nothing to avenge his parents. Meanwhile, Griff was assigned to investigate a robbery that had ended in murder. As part of his investigation, he visited the victim's widow, Mrs. Gilbert, hoping to get a description of the attacker. But she struggled to recall any details because the attack had happened so quickly. With no solid leads, Griff turned to his superior, Spencer, for guidance. Unfortunately, Spencer was dismissive of the case. He brushed it off as just another routine robbery and even made an insensitive remark about how Mrs. Gilbert would at least benefit from her late husband's insurance money. Griff was disgusted by such words, especially coming from a law officer who was supposed to protect the people. Elsewhere, at a busy restaurant, a man named Hanny was having lunch with his colleagues, discussing their business matters. In the middle of their conversation, he noticed Jimmy walking in. Recognizing his old friend, Hanny approached him immediately. It was revealed that Hanny had connections with illegal arms dealers, which was exactly what Jimmy needed. After a brief conversation, Henny agreed to help and took Jimmy to meet a weapons dealer named Trojan. Upon arriving, Trojan led them to a hidden stash, showcasing a wide variety of illegal firearms. Jimmy carefully examined his options, testing a few weapons before finally selecting a gun fitted with a silencer. As Jimmy was about to leave, Henny warned him to be cautious while carrying out his plan. Armed with his new weapon, Jimmy set his sights on one of the murderers, Danny. He carefully followed Danny from his house to a bar, waiting for the right moment to strike. When Danny went to the restroom, Jimmy, now wearing a mask, was already inside, waiting for him. Without hesitation, he launched a fierce attack, knocking Danny unconscious. Moments later, Jimmy dragged the unconscious Danny to a secluded location. When Danny finally regained consciousness, he found himself tied up with Jimmy standing over him. Jimmy's voice was cold and filled with conviction as he told Danny that he would die that night. Danny's face turned pale with fear. He had no idea why Jimmy wanted to kill him, but he could tell from Jimmy's eyes that there would be no mercy. Meanwhile, Rob, who couldn't find Danny at the bar, decided to call his cell phone. To his surprise, Jimmy answered instead. Jimmy's voice was cold and menacing as he told Rob that Danny would die that night, and soon, Rob would meet the same fate. Rob, unfazed by Jimmy's threats, responded with defiance. He boldly challenged Jimmy to face him in person, making it clear that he wasn't afraid. Hearing this, Jimmy felt even more determined and promised that their meeting would happen soon. Once the call ended, Jimmy wasted no time. He mixed cement with water, preparing a gruesome fate for Danny. Seeing what was about to happen, Danny's fear overwhelmed him, and he wet his pants in terror. Without hesitation, Jimmy forcefully poured the thick cement mixture into Danny's mouth, making sure he suffered a slow and agonizing death. The next morning, the police arrived at the crime scene to investigate Danny's murder. Among them was Spencer, who was both intrigued and disturbed by the unusual method of killing. He closely examined Danny's hardened body, realizing that the cement inside had solidified, turning parts of his corpse to stone. Not long after, Griff arrived to assist with the investigation. Spencer, who initially showed little interest, suddenly saw an opportunity. Since murder cases were rare, solving this one could boost his career. Eager for a promotion, he decided to take charge of the case and immediately made some calls to set his plan in motion. Griff and the other officers disliked Spencer's opportunistic attitude. However, Griff soon discovered a chilling truth: Jimmy was the murderer. He found a message left by Jimmy near Danny's body, confirming his suspicions. Despite this, Griff chose to keep the information to himself. Determined to crack the case and advance his career, Spencer continued his investigation at Terry's bar, the last place Danny had visited. There, he approached Debs, the female bartender, and requested access to the bar surveillance footage, hoping it would provide clues about the murder. At the same time, Terry, the bar's owner, had already called the police due to concerns about a group of robbers who frequently disturbed his establishment. Before Spencer could review the footage, Debs expressed her disagreement with Terry's decision to involve the authorities. Terry, however, defended his actions, explaining that he wanted to ensure the safety of his bar and keep troublemakers away. As Terry and Debs debated, Spencer pressed forward with his request, insisting on viewing the surveillance footage to gather more evidence for his case. While reviewing the surveillance footage, Spencer noticed a suspicious scene: a man forcefully shoving someone into the trunk of his car in the parking lot. His instincts told him this was important, so he asked the bar staff to zoom in on the man's face. The clearer image confirmed his suspicions. Jimmy was the perpetrator behind Danny's murder. Wasting no time, Spencer compiled all the evidence, and by the next morning, the police were at Jimmy's apartment, ready to make an arrest. However, Jimmy had just returned home when he spotted the authorities. Without hesitation, he turned his car around and sped off toward Morgan's house, seeking refuge. When the police found Jimmy's apartment empty, they went to Morgan's house instead. They informed her that her husband was the prime suspect in a series of murders that had been making headlines. Before leaving, They handed her a business card, urging her to contact them if she learned of Jimmy's whereabouts. After the officers left, Morgan was furious and overwhelmed. She had never imagined that her husband could be a murderer. Their heated argument made it clear that she couldn't accept what he had done, and she struggled to come to terms with the truth. Jimmy remained at Morgan's house until the afternoon, hiding from the police. They eventually sat down and spoke in hushed tones. He tried to reassure her, promising to take care of everything and asking her to leave town so they could start fresh once his mission was over. However, Jimmy also warned that he wouldn't be able to see her again until he had finished what he started. Heartbroken, Morgan looked at him with sadness, silently hoping he would return to her safely. Now a fugitive, Jimmy stayed low and avoided unnecessary interactions. When he stopped by a small convenience store to buy supplies, 2 police officers recognized him. Without wasting a second, he bolted towards the store's back exit, escaping just in time. Meanwhile, Spencer received word that Jimmy had been spotted. Wasting no time, he rushed to the location and immediately ordered the officers to arrest him. Jimmy slipped through the back alley, cautiously making his way through the narrow streets. Suddenly, he found himself face to face with one of the officers who had identified him earlier. Before he could react, a van screeched to a halt nearby. 2 large men suddenly jumped out and swiftly overpowered the police officers, knocking them unconscious. Believing the men to be enemies, Jimmy quickly raised his gun. In response, the 2 men drew their own weapons. The situation grew tense until an older man stepped out of the van and commanded his men to lower their guns. Jimmy's eyes widened in shock. Standing before him was Colonel Leach, his former leader from his time serving in Afghanistan. Not long after, Jimmy stepped into the van and faced Colonel Leach. He hadn't expected to meet his former commander there. As they spoke, Jimmy learned that Leach had come for him with an offer. He wanted Jimmy to return to Afghanistan and serve as a soldier again. Leach reminded him that, as a soldier, he had a duty to be ready whenever called upon. However, Jimmy firmly refused. He had unfinished business to take care of, and he told Leach that he needed more time. Leach tried to persuade him, insisting that a man with his skills could never truly live a normal life. But Jimmy was determined. In the end, Leach gave him 2 days to settle his personal affairs before expecting him to return. Meanwhile, Spencer arrived at the alley where Jimmy had last been spotted, only to find the 2 police officers lying on the ground, badly beaten. Frustration filled him. He had just missed his chance to capture Jimmy. Elsewhere, Griff met with James, a former colleague of Jimmy's from their time in Afghanistan. Griff knew that Spencer had paid James to track down and capture Jimmy. Hoping to change his mind, Griff tried to convince James to let Jimmy go. But James remained firm, saying he was just doing his job. Griff then revealed Spencer's true motives. He explained that if Spencer succeeded in arresting Jimmy, he would be promoted to police inspector. Griff didn't want that to happen because he believed Spencer would only damage the police force's reputation. He urged James to walk away from the job and leave Jimmy alone. As Griff left, James sat in silence, clearly thinking over everything he had just heard. Later that day, Spencer arrived at a restaurant for a meal, but his peace was short-lived. A journalist named Julia approached him, pressing for details about Jimmy's murder case. Annoyed by her persistence, Spencer scowled and abruptly left the restaurant, refusing to engage with her. That night, at a crowded bar, Ryan was enjoying himself, unaware of the danger lurking nearby. Suddenly, a waiter handed him an envelope. Inside, he found a chilling photograph. It was Danny's lifeless body. Panic surged through him as he nervously glanced around. Then, his heart nearly stopped when he spotted Jimmy watching him from across the bar. Fear took over, and without hesitation, Ryan bolted out of the bar, with Jimmy following close behind. Ryan sped through the streets, desperately trying to escape as Jimmy pursued him in a car. He swerved around corners and raced through empty roads, but his luck ran out when he found himself trapped in a dead-end alley, blocked by a tall fence. Before he could react, Jimmy got out his car, stormed toward him, and knocked him unconscious with a heavy blow. When Ryan regained consciousness, panic set in. His hands were tightly bound to the back of a car, while his feet were shackled with iron chains. Trembling, he looked up at Jimmy with fear in his eyes and begged for mercy. He apologized repeatedly, pleading for his life. But Jimmy remained cold and silent, unmoved by his words. Without hesitation, Jimmy got into the car, started the engine, and stepped on the gas. The vehicle jerked forward, dragging Ryan along the rough ground. His screams echoed through the empty alley, but they faded quickly. Within moments, his body went limp, lifeless. Once Jimmy was certain that Ryan was dead, he brought the car to a stop, unfastened the chains, and left the scene without looking back. The next morning, Spencer met with his superior on a bridge to discuss the ongoing murder case. His boss reminded him of the urgency of solving it and emphasized that he needed to bring the killer to justice as soon as possible. Later, Spencer sat in a coffee shop, lost in thought, trying to figure out the best way to track down and arrest Jimmy. Meanwhile, Colonel Leach, determined to help Jimmy avoid capture, happened to enter the same coffee shop. As he placed his order, he spotted Spencer and approached him. Leach attempted to start a conversation, but Spencer, not recognizing him, barely acknowledged his presence. Undeterred, Leach pressed on. He firmly told Spencer that Jimmy was one of his men and warned him not to interfere. Spencer, unimpressed, shot back that Jimmy had broken the law and had to be held accountable. Hearing this, Leach decided to share a story about Jimmy's time in Afghanistan. He recounted an intense battle in September 2009 when his unit detected an impending Taliban ambush. Thanks to Jimmy's quick thinking and exceptional combat skills, they managed to eliminate the threat without suffering a single casualty. Finishing his story, Leach leaned in and issued a final warning. He told Spencer that Jimmy was no ordinary man. He was a highly trained soldier, someone who had survived real wars. It would be best for Spencer to leave him alone. However, Spencer ignored the warning. He was too focused on his ambition of becoming a police inspector. He boldly stated that he would arrest Jimmy no matter what. Leach, growing frustrated, narrowed his eyes and made it clear that if Spencer insisted on pursuing Jimmy, he would step in, and he wouldn't stand by quietly. The scene then shifted to a high-level meeting where the police commissioner, Shields, and Inspector Wales gathered under the leadership of Commander Carter. As the meeting commenced, Carter handed over a file detailing Jimmy's background and urged the officials to drop the charges against him. He explained that Jimmy was a former member of the Special Air Service, an elite combat unit, and his skills were still valuable to the country. As a result, Carter announced his plan to reinstate Jimmy into the SAS. Shields, skeptical of this request, questioned who Jimmy's superior was, but Carter simply replied that such information was not for the police to know. Shields strongly objected, arguing that Jimmy was a dangerous criminal who had committed serious offenses. However, Carter insisted that the police had no choice but to release him. That night, Rob was walking home to his apartment, unaware that Jimmy had been watching him from the shadows. Suddenly, Jimmy appeared, pressing a gun to Rob's head and forcing him to walk to Caleb's apartment. Upon arrival, Jimmy used Rob as a human shield while he opened fire on Caleb and his men, eliminating them one by one. Caleb's girlfriend, who attempted to shoot Jimmy with a shotgun, was also killed in the chaos. With Caleb still alive, Jimmy restrained him in a chair and placed a container of acid nearby. He demanded the password to Caleb's safe, leaving him no choice but to comply. After retrieving stacks of money and drug packages from the safe, Jimmy tossed them into the acid, watching as they dissolved. Caleb, weak and horrified, desperately tried to stop him, but it was futile. Finally, Jimmy lifted the container and poured the acid over Caleb's head, ending his life in agony. The next day, Spencer summoned Griff to his office. Once inside, Spencer accused Griff of conspiring with Jimmy and aiding his killing spree. As a result, he aggressively demanded to know who Jimmy's next target was. Griff, however, firmly denied the accusations. His refusal to cooperate enraged Spencer, leading him to remove Griff from the case. Spencer made it clear that he wouldn't tolerate anyone bending the rules like Jimmy. Instead of reacting with anger, Griff merely smirked and challenged Spencer to catch Jimmy if he could. Frustrated, Spencer watched as Griff walked out, his determination to solve the case intensifying with each passing moment. Later, at a busy newspaper office, the editor-in-chief, Alex, calls over a senior journalist named Julia. He gives her an important task to publish an article about a case involving a man named Jimmy. Following his instructions, Julia writes and publishes a story that quickly stirs up controversy. In her article, she presents Jimmy not as a murderer, but as a local hero. She argues that he only killed dangerous criminals who had long terrorized the community. When the article appears in the newspaper, it causes an uproar. Spencer, as a police officer in charge of Jimmy's case, is immediately furious. The public is beginning to sympathize with Jimmy, making Spencer's job much harder. His superiors start pressuring him even more to solve the case and bring Jimmy to justice. Frustrated and determined to prove himself, Spencer comes up with a plan. Spencer visits Rob, who is recovering in a hospital from injuries he sustained during a shooting at Caleb's house. Desperate to strengthen his case against Jimmy, Spencer orders Rob to break into Jimmy's house and gather any evidence that could be used against him. If they can frame Jimmy, Spencer believes his chances of getting a promotion will improve. With Spencer's help, Rob is able to leave the hospital and carry out the mission. He sneaks into Jimmy's house and begins searching for anything that could be useful. While looking around, he discovers several photographs of Jimmy from his time serving in Afghanistan. Along with the photos, he finds a large pile of letters addressed to Jimmy. As he sorts through them, he comes across one letter with a specific home address written on it. Realizing it could be important, he decides to investigate further. Rob follows the address, and sometime later, he is seen meeting with a man to complete a drug deal. After the transaction, he returns to his car, lights up the drugs he just purchased, and takes a deep breath. Just then, he suddenly feels a gun pressing against him. Jimmy is already inside his car, waiting for him. Without giving Rob much choice, Jimmy orders him to drive. With no other option, Rob obeys and drives to the location Jimmy instructs. He pulls up near a quiet riverside, far away from a city. Once they arrive, Jimmy takes him hostage, restraining him and preparing a syringe filled with a mysterious chemical. He explains that the liquid will slowly destroy Rob's organs from the inside. Before injecting him, Jimmy gives him a chance to say his last words. Instead of pleading for his life, Rob spits at Jimmy and hurls insults at him. This enrages Jimmy, who punches him repeatedly. Despite his injuries, Rob smirks and tells Jimmy to open the trunk of his car. He claims that he has left a surprise that Jimmy will never forget. Curious and suspicious, Jimmy follows Rob's suggestion. As he opens the trunk, his eyes widen in shock. Inside lies the lifeless body of Morgan, someone Jimmy deeply cared about. Overcome with grief and anger, Jimmy's rage reaches its peak. Rob, seeing his pain, takes the opportunity to taunt him even more, cruelly reminding him that he has lost everyone he ever loved. Enraged beyond control, Jimmy raises his gun and shoots Rob, ending his life. Moments later, the sound of sirens fills the air. A team of heavily armed police officers, led by Spencer, arrives at the scene and surrounds Jimmy. With their weapons aimed at him, Spencer steps forward and orders Jimmy to drop his gun. At that moment, he urges Jimmy to surrender peacefully before the officers are forced to take action against him. As Griff arrived at the scene, he was shocked to discover Morgan's lifeless body in the trunk of a car. Angered by Spencer's actions, he confronted everyone, revealing that Spencer was the true mastermind behind the chaos. He accused Spencer of helping Rob escape from the hospital just to lure Jimmy out of hiding. If Spencer hadn't done this, Morgan would still be alive. Griff kept pressuring Spencer to admit his wrongdoing. Eventually, Spencer was forced to confess that he had indeed allowed Rob to leave the hospital to set a trap for Jimmy. However, Spencer defended himself, arguing that he had no choice because Griff had let Jimmy, a supposed murderer, remain free instead of arresting him. Upon hearing this, the leader of the armed police unit who had arrived with Spencer ordered his men to lower their weapons. Disappointed and disgusted by Spencer's deceitful tactics to capture Jimmy for his own career gain, the officer decided not to take action against Jimmy. One by one, the police officers on the scene stepped aside, allowing Jimmy to walk away. Spencer, watching this unfold, was left in shock and disbelief. He had expected the police to arrest Jimmy, not let him go. Frustrated and unwilling to accept his failure, Spencer suddenly grabbed a gun from one of the armed officers. He attempted to attack Jimmy while his guard was down. However, Jimmy was quick to react. He swiftly turned, aimed his own gun at Spencer, and knocked him to the ground. After overpowering Spencer, Jimmy walked away, leaving him behind. The film's final scene shifts to the nighttime streets of London. In a quiet neighborhood, a pregnant woman steps out of her house to dispose of the trash in a narrow alley behind her home. As she does so, two thugs appear from the shadows and grab her, covering her mouth to silence her screams. Just at that moment, Jimmy arrives. The thugs, showing no fear, warn Jimmy to stay out of their business. One of them begins counting to 3, giving him a chance to walk away. However, instead of looking intimidated, Jimmy simply smiles at their threat. The film ends. So the moral of the story is, don't try to climb the career ladder by chasing a one-man army. It's bad for your health and your promotion prospects. Also, if you want to turn someone into a human statue, make sure the model has good posture.